It's Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. Hello, and welcome to Monster Mondays. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, co-host of the podcast Film Seizure, that you can catch each Wednesday at filmseizure.com or at a number of podcast providers online. Now, we've got ourselves a real treat for this week's featured movie. I'm looking at 1931's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, directed by Ruben Mamalian, and this stars Fredric March. There's a lot to discuss about this movie. One thing I am going to say is that throughout the course of this movie, and I do believe it was Stevenson's own intention that the character of Dr. Jekyll was actually pronounced Dr. Jekyll, which is the case in this movie. It is much more popular in terms of pop culturally to refer to it as Dr. Jekyll. That's how I'm going to refer to it during this movie, although the pronunciation can go both ways. But anyway, let's talk about the source of this. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde was released in 1886, and Robert Louis Stevenson was a Scottish writer who worked mostly on things like novels, and as is the case with Dr. Jekyll, novellas, but he also wrote essays and travel books. Pop culturally, we probably remember him most for Jekyll and Hyde and, of course, Treasure Island, the latter definitely being something that is often referenced, adapted, and even taught in schools. However, in a more critical level, what is often deemed his best work was a collection of short stories that were published in 1882 called New Arabian Nights. He would ultimately die pretty young at the age of 44 of a stroke in Samoa, where he spent the last years of his life. He was often viewed as a real critic and kind of philosopher about the art of writing itself and what was good and bad for the medium of books. He is often thought of as a fiercely political person in his time as well. He's often even considered a darling in libertarian circles. Now, while Jekyll and Hyde has been adapted over the years and decades, this isn't actually even the first. There was a 1920 version starring John Barrymore, who was originally approached by Paramount, who was producing this version, but he declined because he was under contract at MGM. So eventually the role would go to Fredric March. Now, March came from Racine, Wisconsin, and he had somewhat humble beginnings. In his late teens, he served in World War I for the United States Army. He then he came home and became a banker. However, when he nearly died and needed an emergency appendectomy, he had a serious change of heart and reevaluated his life. And he started working as an extra in movies made in and around New York City in 1920. He then went to Broadway in the mid-20s, and by the end of that decade, he was a contract player for Paramount. He was noted for being rather good at slipping into his roles. He is normally mentioned in the same breath as Sir Laurence Olivier for being able to basically completely eradicate the line between actor and role and fully embody any character he was playing. And trust me, we're going to talk more about his performance throughout the course of this episode. But Fredric March is considered a massive star of the 30s and 40s. Ben Mankiewicz of Turner Classic Movies called March one of two eminent Hollywood actors of those 2 decades. The other, Spencer Tracy. So to be named alongside Tracy, and as I did previously, Olivier, that should say something about March. Now, interestingly, Tracy would play Jekyll and Hyde later in another rendition of this story. But March was nominated 5 times for Best Actor at the Academy Awards. He won twice. His first Oscar was for this movie, making it an early indication that horror could be a viable and serious genre. The second came 15 years later for The Best Years of Our Lives. As for Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it premiered on New Year's Eve, 1931 in LA and New York before getting a full release to the rest of the United States a few days later. It received pretty positive reviews all in all. Interestingly, the budget was a little under $550,000, and it really only brought in about $1.25 million in rentals in the US and Canada. So it was really just a mild hit. But While not being made by Universal Pictures, the film rivaled their stars Dracula and Frankenstein in merit, production value, and an excellent makeup effect. And as I said previously, March won the Academy Award for Best Actor just a few months after its release. Now, one side note about that Oscar win for March, he technically tied for Best Actor with Wallace Beery for Beery's performance in The Champ. However, in truth, March technically won the award outright by having one single vote more than Beery. I'm not entirely sure why it was called a tie at that point. I'm sure there is a good reason, maybe something in the rules of the time, but I didn't really find anything in the cursory research I did upon learning that fact. But finally, another thing about March before we dive in is into talking about this movie proper. There was a bit of unfortunate controversy surrounding Fredric March that sprung up a few years ago that has wrongfully tarnished his legacy. It is true that in 1919 and 1920, while still at University of Wisconsin-Madison, he was part of a fraternity of leading students called, unfortunately, the Ku Klux Klan. However, it has never been proven at all that it was connected with the infamous National White Supremacist organization of the same name. In 1922, that fraternity changed its name so as to not be affiliated with the hate group as popularity for the national, more infamous KKK grew. March was actually a pretty big proponent and ally of the civil rights movement. He was a big supporter of the NAACP. Fast forward to the 2010s and false rumors spread about the UW-Madison KKK affiliation with the more famous KKK, and it led to Fredric March being labeled a white supremacist, which was simply just not founded in anything other than left-wing online reactionary outrage. This led to March's name being removed from theaters at a couple of UW campuses after students' protests based on these false rumors. As of the fall of 2020, discussions began to reinstate March's name to those theaters after new info was found out about the actual organization March really belonged to. And so let that just be a reminder that reactionary outrage is bad on both sides of the political spectrum, people. Now, this movie opens with a really neat first-person view from Dr. Jekyll's perspective as he prepares to go to a lecture at an English college where he is set up to speak. This is a really innovative series of shots. We're looking down at his hands as he plays the organ. We see him looking at himself in the mirror. There are long takes as he goes about the house and then rides in a carriage to the school. I imagine something like this was pretty brand new in movies in 1931, especially considering how big the cameras used to be. Being able to kind of have that first person look down at March playing the piano or playing the organ, and then to have him look at himself in a mirror. I'm sure there was probably some sort of effect where really March was on the other side of what was thought to be the mirror, but I could be wrong on that. But either which way, it's a really, really cool, a really cool shot in a series of shots. Anyway, Jekyll's lecture is about the soul of man. He believes people have two opposing personalities. In one, the person strives for good things. In the other is pure barbarism. It's basically a fight between the id and the superego. The struggle creates the repression of the bad side and the remorse within the good side. And he wants to find a way to liberate people from the evil in their hearts. And he's been experimenting with chemicals that might have the qualities of actually being able to physically separate the two sides of a person. And Jekyll is a good doctor. He personally treats the poor in the free ward. His fiancée, Muriel's father, a retired military general and old fuddy-duddy, thinks that this makes him a little too idealistic and dedicated to medicine as opposed to his daughter, who spoils Jekyll with adoration. Muriel's father just doesn't even think of Jekyll as good enough for her, which is wild to think because of how much Jekyll really is a good doctor. It's insane. Like, he is so good at being a doctor. He's actually like well known in the streets of Soho for being the guy that takes care of the poor. And this is not good enough for Muriel's father. It's insane. But anyway, like I said, he's an old fuddy-duddy. But Dr. Jekyll asks Muriel to marry him immediately as he's hopelessly in love with her. She too wants to marry him, but is generally concerned about her father's insistence on the two of them waiting to get married until her father's wedding anniversary, because I don't know, he just says that that's what needs to happen. But on the way home from the general's dinner party, Jekyll sees a nightclub singer named Ivy. She's being beaten up by a man, and she attempts to seduce Jekyll. And when he tries to take his leave after checking her over with her mild injuries, he rejects her, but she is not above trying once more to seduce him by removing her stockings and garters and then the rest of her clothes to get into bed, which is something he ordered her to do. He ordered her to rest. And after she strips totally, she attempts to kiss him, but it's broken up by his colleague coming into the room. Ivy wants Jekyll to come visit her again, but he more or less tells her that is impossible on the way out. And when he is scolded by his colleague for his behavior, as if it was his idea to kiss Ivy, he asks the simple question, well, what if I liked it? It doesn't matter if I like her or not. What matters is what I do with this now, basically, is what he's saying. So he is kind of giving in to his id by saying, well, I kind of like this girl, and I like the idea of her kissing me. I like the kiss. But he is also living up to his superego by saying, he's better than that. He's not going to return to her. He accepted the kiss, he says, as his payment. So he is straddling this line between the good and the bad inside of him already. But later, Jekyll continues his research on a formula that he believes will separate the evil side of a person from his good side. Believing he has cracked the formula, he decides to test the potion on himself, and he transforms into the diabolical Mr. Hyde. Exclaiming that he is free at last, Mr. Hyde takes off into the day. Now later, Dr. Jekyll returns to himself and tells his butler that the other voice that the butler heard in the lab was Jekyll's friend Hyde, and he's already left. He left out through the back door. Now Jekyll's desire to marry Muriel only grows stronger, as does his frustration that he has to be told to wait, this time by Muriel herself. When she kind of unexpectedly leaves town with her father for a month, a dejected and rejected Jekyll takes the potion once more and seeks out the singer Ivy. He finds her at the music hall and has the staff bring her over for a bottle of wine. She is utterly repulsed by him, but she agrees to sit for a bit. But she is not comforted to know he knows where she lives, and she really doesn't like when he violently shoos away another admirer. He then holds her arm and pulls her back onto him, basically preventing her from being able to get away from him, and then demands that she come with him. And what happens over the next few weeks is that Hyde supports Ivy monetarily with the exchange of basically giving him quote unquote companionship, if you know what I mean, and I think you do. So this arrangement is a complete and total nightmare. He uses the arrangement to rape and psychologically torture and manipulate Ivy. In that month, while Muriel was gone, Jekyll's practically lost himself in Hyde. He's almost addicted to kind of giving into his id. He's hardly been around his home. He's not seen his patients. He's not written to Muriel. He's simply just taken what he's wanted from Ivy. With Muriel's return from her sojourn, Hyde tells Ivy that he's going to go away for a little while, and he will return when she least expects it. But before he leaves, he's going to spend one last night with her, which includes a lot of physical torture this time around. Now, before planning to see Muriel, Jekyll does send his butler to Ivy's apartment to basically pay her £50 out of the absolute guilt that he has for treating her the way he did as Hyde. He goes to Muriel and begs for forgiveness for not writing her while she was away, and he again asks her to marry him in 1 month's time instead of the 6 or 7 months down the line that her father is kind of stuck on. She agrees and even convinces her father to allow this, but Jekyll's joy is short-lived as Ivy has come to consult him after she found out that the great Dr. Jekyll was the one who gave her the £50. She refuses the money and shows Jekyll the whiplashes that she's taken from Hyde. Knowing Jekyll is kind and knowing that he helped her when he didn't have to previously, she begs him for help. Either help her rid herself of Hyde or give her poison so that she may kill herself. She even throws herself at Jekyll, but in a slightly different way than before. She even says that she would basically work for him, basically pledges anything he could possibly want, even work for him as a slave. Realizing how much he hurt her, he tells her that she will never again see Mr. Hyde and that she has his word, something that he never breaks. Now, as he makes his way to his engagement party being held at Muriel's father's home, he stops to admire a singing bird in a tree and believing that everything is just great now. Everything's coming up Dr. Jekyll. But when a cat stalks and attacks to kill the bird, he's overcome with a doom-filled realization that death is all around him. This unexpectedly triggers a transformation into Mr. Hyde, and instead of going to the party, he goes to Ivy's and kills her, but not before revealing that he and Jekyll, her angel and her devil, are actually one and the same. Hyde tries to return home, but Jekyll's butler refuses him entry, so Hyde sends Jekyll's colleague a message to gather certain chemicals from his lab, stating that basically Jekyll is in dire distress and he needs these things to help. And Hyde goes to the colleague's house to get the chemicals, but the colleague refuses to let Hyde go without going to see for himself that Jekyll is indeed safe. Hyde makes the concoction to drink right there in Jekyll's colleague's home, and he transforms back into Jekyll. His colleague forces Jekyll to swear he never will mix the concoction ever again. The good doctor also swears that he will go to Muriel in the morning and set her free. When Jekyll goes to break off the engagement, she cries, which triggers another transformation into Hyde. He attacks Muriel, but when her father intervenes, Hyde kills the old man with Jekyll's own walking cane. Hyde initially evades the police and gets back to Jekyll's lab when it's revealed that the murder weapon is Jekyll's own cane. The police bust into Jekyll's lab, who tells the police that Hyde escaped through the back door. But Jekyll's own colleague and friend fingers him as the killer. From the stress, Jekyll transforms back into Hyde and attempts to escape once again, but is ultimately shot by the police. As he dies, he transforms back into Dr. Jekyll one final time. So let's talk about the three things I like about 1931's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. First, I already talked about the innovative way that the movie is shot from the first person early on. This is repeated later when Jekyll tests this potion on himself and he looks into the mirror and transforms into Mr. Hyde for the first time. However, in this instance, it's the makeup effect on his transformation that is even more innovative. The makeup effect Wally Westmore employed was kept secret for more than 35 years. It was later revealed that it wasn't the typical crossfade effects like with 1941's The Wolfman, although that is used a couple of times in this movie as well. Instead, it was a makeup that was affected by different light and effects with the lighting, different gels, different colored things put over the stage lights. As different gels and effects were applied to the set, layers of the makeup became visible. That had to be amazing to see for the first time. Hell, I bet it terrified some people too. Westmore's look of the ape-like Hyde with the hair-covered body and the fuzzy hair on top of his head and the animalistic canines and buck teeth would set the standard for the character's look for the next many decades. Second, the transformation isn't just physical. Fredric March is brilliant in this movie. He purposely opted to play both Jekyll and Hyde with exaggerated mannerisms and speech like he was on a stage. It greatly benefits the movie and our own general involvement in the movie. Jekyll's impatience and impulsive behavior really makes him flawed despite his love for Muriel and his general love of his patients and desire to cure them. But it also makes him kind of selfish, which makes him very interesting. He's almost addicted to being the good guy, yet he also cannot abide by his fiance's wishes to wait, and you can see that eating him from the inside. As Hyde, holy cow, March is a completely different person. You can't even really tell it's the same actor. That's how good the performance is. His joy in seeing people pushed around at the music hall and his bullying of the staff to give him service is just menacing as hell. He is a complete monster as Hyde. It's easy to see how March got his first Oscar for this. He splits his screen time between two characters, and yet each performance for the characters is a complete one. Now, thirdly, this is a movie that is also greatly benefited by being a movie that came out before the Hays Code went into full effect. The Hays Code put a lot of censorship guidelines into films. This was what was put into place before the rating system. It basically kind of watered down most movies, particularly in the horror genre. But the movies that came out before the Hays Code and was able to kind of slip through that, they could really kind of do some dark stuff. And that's what's the case here. Ivy, played by Miriam Hopkins, is excellent in this movie. While she is presented originally as a lower class woman, she is totally appealing. Her flirtatious seduction of Jekyll is both cute and incredibly sexy, but when he returns to her as Hyde, holy shit, it really does seem as though she is completely and totally terrified. Her scenes with March are just exceptional. In the scene as Hyde, when he visits her for the last night together, Hopkins doesn't look frightened by Hyde. She seems almost terrified of March himself. That's how good he is and how good she is in it. Both are totally feeding off of each other as actors. And it really makes these scenes so much more mature and adult for this era, thanks to the code not being in effect. On top of that, we know exactly what's going on between Hyde and Ivy. She's being raped by him. She's being tortured by him. It's dark as hell, and it makes this movie the true horror film that it really is. Now, there's a pretty damn key bit of trivia about Miriam Hopkins, too. All through this movie, I kept thinking, man, she is fantastic in this. I was completely taken by her performance as Ivy. I looked a little further into Hopkins, and I discovered she did eventually get an Oscar nomination for Best Actress in the 1935 movie Becky Sharp. She was the very first performance from a color film to be nominated for an acting Oscar. Obviously, others found her acting skills to be pretty darn good too. As for Rose Hobart, who plays Muriel, she was unfortunately blacklisted by the anti-communist activists and the McCarthy House Committee on Un-American Activities group, all because of her efforts to make working conditions better for actors to avoid 18-plus hour work days. She was not even a communist, nor was she really all that friendly to the party at all. She was angry at being subpoenaed and being fingered as a communist sympathizer. And when she basically only read a prepared statement instead of testifying when she was subpoenaed, that basically sealed her deal. Even though she would get some small acting jobs on TV about 20 years after her final film, the blacklisting effectively ended her career. And it's just terrible what really kind of happened to her, and what happened to a lot of actors at that time. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. You can catch new episodes of Monster Mondays each Monday at filmseizure.com. Don't forget to follow Film Seizure at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, and Blue Sky. You can also subscribe to Film Seizure to get both the Wednesday Film Seizure Podcast and Monster Mondays at your favorite podcast providers. We also upload those to YouTube as well. You can also check out my website, bmovieenema.com, to read new articles every Friday morning. Next week, we discuss a creature that I don't think I've ever really talked about on this program before. Join me as I discover if Bigfoot truly exists. Until next week, stay spooky.